الله الرحمن الرحيم. دار البلاغ للإنتاج والتوزيع تقدم
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
عما يتساءلون عن النبأ العظيم الذي هم فيه مختلفون. كلا سيعلمون ثم كلا سيعلمون. ألم نجعل الأرض مهادا والجبال أوتادا وخلقناكم أزواجا وجعلنا نومكم سباتا وجعلنا الليل لباسا وجعلنا النهار معاشا وبنينا فوقكم سبعا شدادا وجعلنا سراجا وهاجا وأنزلنا من المعصرات ماء ثجاجا لنخرج به حبا ونباتا وجنات ألفافا. إن يوم الفصل كان ميقاتا يوم ينفخ في الصور فتأتون أفواجا وفتحت السماء فكانت أبوابا وسيرت الجبال فكانت سرابا. إن جهنم كانت مرصادا للطاغين مآبا لابثين فيها أحقابا لا يذوقون فيها بردا ولا شرابا إلا حميما وغساقا جزاء وفاقا. إنهم كانوا لا يرجون حسابا وكذبوا بآياتنا كذابا وكل شيء أحصيناه كتابا فذوقوا فلن نزيدكم إلا عذابا. إن للمتقين مفازا حدائق وأعنابا وكواعب أترابا وكأسا دهاقا لا يسمعون فيها لغوا ولا
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. His household followers and all those who follow the path of Allah to the day of judgment. Welcome you to our second production on the series on Islam. This morning we'll be looking at the all-important subject of Islam in the Bible. I'm saying all-important because with Muslims living in a multi-religious community where they constantly interact with Christians who are interested in knowing what Islam stands for. Not only that, from time to time, the Muslim is questioned about whether the Bible said anything about Islam. Indeed, Quran chapter 5 verse 157, aware of the fact that the religion from Allah is a continuous chain which ended up with Islam. In this direction, the Quran states, in respect of those who had received the book of Allah before the Prophet ﷺ, Allah refers to them in the following manner. الذين يتبعون الرسول النبي الأمي الذي يجدونه مكتوبا عندهم في التوراة والإنجيل. That those who were Christians and Jews, and upon hearing the message of Allah, respect of the Prophet ﷺ, some of them accepted Islam. Some of them followed the path of Islam. Some of them followed the path of truth. And the Quran is describing them in this text in Quran chapter 7, verse 157. The book says, الذين يتبعون الرسول النبي الأمي. They are those who follow the messenger, النبي الأمي, the prophet who was unlettered, who had not been schooled anywhere. الذي يجدونه مكتوبا عندهم, the one that they find written in their own book, في التوراة والإنجيل, in the Old and the New Testament. Meaning the prophet has been adequately mentioned in the Old Testament and the New Testament. I'm referring to this text specifically to knock home the fact that the religion of Muhammad has some foundations in the Bible. To start with, I will pose the question, what is Islam? Islam linguistically means peace, submission, and harmony. Peace, submission, and harmony. But technically, it is explained as the total submission to the will of Allah. Total submission to the will of Allah. And that represents the practical and the empirical component of Islam. Two great scholars have done an extensive work on this definition, Yusuf Qaradawi and Muhammad Qutb. And they indicated clearly that the expression total submission means that the Quran has three key components: sound faith, sound worship, and sound dealings with people. Invariably, therefore, if we are to examine Islam in the Bible, I suggest that we look at that subject from these three perspectives: sound worship, sound faith, sound worship, and then sound dealings with people. So point number one, sound faith. When we speak of sound faith, you are speaking of belief in one God. And Quran chapter 112 is very clear on this subject. And it states, Qul, say, Huwa Allahu Ahad, He, Allah, is one. And in knocking home the oneness of Allah in a very incisive, thought-provoking, insightful manner, and of course in a very logical manner, Quran chapter 21 points out the following fact: لو كان فيهما آلهة إلا الله لفسدتا. That if there had been gods apart from the Almighty, who created the heavens and the earth and everything that is in the universe, the sky and the earth would have been in a state of confusion. In other words, لو كان فيهما آلهة إلا الله, that is the earth and the heaven. If there had been any gods apart from the Almighty who created them, the two would have been in constant state of confusion. What this means is that the constant order that we see, the non-existence of conflict between the two creatures, and the unique order that constantly repeats itself on a daily basis, clearly shows that one God is in control. That is the strong argument of the Quran. Philip K. Hitti, in his book History of the Arabs, points out that of all the three monotheistic religions, that is Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, Philip K. Hitti states clearly that Islam stands out of the three with its unique and pristine monotheism, that is, belief in one God. In other words, Philip K. Hitti is saying that Islam is completely different when it comes to the belief in the oneness of Allah. Of course, we don't have to take our minds a bit far to know what the import of this statement is. Judaism, after believing in Allah, added human features to him. And that particular description of Allah abounds in Genesis, Exodus, and various pages of the Bible. Christians have adopted Trinity, which is a deviation from the oneness of Allah. Islam alone stands out unique and insists and emphasizes and states strongly and categorically that there is only one God. And that is the point Philip K. Hitti is trying to knock home. Dr. Laura Vicia, the famous Italian Orientalist. An Orientalist is a Westerner, somebody from Europe or America, who is interested in studying Islamic issues. This woman writes about Islamic faith in the following words in her book, An Interpretation of Islam. And she states on page 30 of that book, the Arabian prophet, with a voice which was inspired by a deep communion with his maker, preached the purest monotheism, that's oneness of Allah, to the worshippers of fetish and the followers of a corrupted Christianity and Judaism. Truly, from the words of Genesis, that's the beginning of the Bible, all the way to the book of Revelations, from beginning of the Bible up to the end, you can clearly see dotted in the book facts about the oneness of Allah. That clearly shows that the original faith, which was preached by Jesus and the prophets before him, was monotheism, oneness of Allah. In the Old Testament, Exodus chapter 20, I'm dealing with the oneness of Allah from the perspective of the Bible. Exodus chapter 20, that is where the 10 Commandments are. And the first issue, Exodus chapter 20 verse 1, states clearly that, hear, O Israel, your God is one God. Simple, straightforward language. One does not need any interpretation to understand this clear message from the Almighty, that your God is only one. In the New Testament, Jesus said in Mark 12, verses 29 to 30, and I quote, the first of all the commandments, the first of all the commandments is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. I believe you agree with me. The language is straightforward, coming from the messenger of Allah, Jesus, that the first of all the commandments is to believe in one God. Matthew 4:10, where Shaitan attempted to deceive Jesus, and Jesus responded in the following manner, in an address to Shaitan. Matthew 4:10, Matthew chapter 4 verse 10. You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. Allahu Akbar. Jesus is directing Shaitan to worship only Allah fact, Jesus foresaw the temptation of he being worshipped by his followers, and therefore described himself in a particular manner and shifted the mentality of his followers from worshipping him. First, he described himself as a human being in Luke chapter 9 verse 44. And then when Peter, the leader of the disciples, was describing Jesus, he described him as a human being in Acts chapter 2 verse 22. And he said, Jesus, a man approved of God. To make the point much clearer for us, to understand the human nature of Allah, of the human nature of Jesus Christ, and that he had been sent by the Almighty, he made the following utterances. John 5:30, he said, I can of my own self do nothing. Meaning he was powerless and helpless. And that whatever thing that he was doing was an empowerment from the Almighty. In John 14:24, Jesus said, all that you are hearing from me is not mine, but the Father who sent me. Meaning he was a messenger from the Almighty. And in Mark 13:32, Jesus was asked about the day of judgment. And he said, Mark 13:32, and of that day, nor that hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, except the Father. And in John 12:38-44, which gives an account of the greatest miracle performed by Jesus, and that was praying for the resurrection of Lazarus. In this very chapter, John 12:38-44, when Lazarus had died and had been buried, on the third day, or after some few days had passed, he asked Martha to remove the entrance to the tomb. And then the woman said he would be smelling, meaning he had gone bad, had gotten rotten, and that he would be smelling. And Jesus said, if you believe in Allah, you see his wonders, you see his glory. And the entrance to the tomb was removed. And Jesus started praying. He started praying very silently. Silently. And continuously silent. Then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intervened and started giving life to Lazarus, when his body started shaking up, Jesus started to pray loudly. He started to pray loudly. Why did he change the tone of the prayer? Initially, he was praying silently. And now he's changed it to pray openly to the hearing of the bystanders. The reason is very simple. And he himself said, he did that, he started praying openly on the account of those who stood by, so that they will know that you did it. Because if he had continuously prayed silently, not to the hearing of the people who were standing by, and he prayed silently, and Lazarus was resurrected, the people standing by would say Jesus was very powerful, and that he did it, and the credit was his, and that the glory would have to be given to him. But because Jesus wanted to take all this credit away from himself and give every credit, every glory, and every honor to the Almighty, he started praying openly. And as I indicated earlier, he himself was playing by saying that on the account of the people who are standing by, so that they will know that you did it. You, the Almighty, the creator of the heavens and the earth, did it, and not Jesus. With this background, it is clearly evident that the faith of Jesus was oneness of Allah. The faith of Moses was oneness of Allah. The faith of Abraham was oneness of Allah. And no wonder, it was the same faith that was repeated by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, and explained in a more detail by him. And when you take the entire book of the Quran, about 1/3 of that book deals with Tawheed, the oneness of Allah. In view of its critical importance, because if one's faith in Allah is shaky, if one believes in 2, 3, 4, 5 gods in addition to the Almighty, it is an act of shirk. And the Quran says, وَمَنْ يُشْرِكْ بِاللَّهِ, that anyone who associates any being with Allah is a deviation. That person has brought a curse on himself. That person has introduced an injustice into his life. So distinctly, the faith in Allah should be one. We believe in him alone. It is on him we rely. And the Quran says, وَمَنْ يَتَوَكَّلَ عَلَى اللَّهِ فَهُوَ حَسْبُهُ, that anyone who relies on Allah, Allah is sufficient for him. It was this simple message that the Bible was sending across. And I was impressed with a particular statement, direction by the Archbishop, retired. In the early 70s, a young man from the Catholic Church used to stand at KGTR and preached. On some occasions, you'll find him stepping on the Quran. His name was Pobi. He died some time ago. The matter was reported to the Archbishop. That was around 1971. I was in SS2. I remember that incident very well. It's clear in my mind what happened. And a team of Muslim scholars from Zongo met the Archbishop and registered their protest and lodged an official complaint with him. The learned bishop said 2 things, or 3. He said they had not sent him to do that dirty job at Kegetia, to insult Muslims and inflict pain on their faith. And that the Quran is the book that he relies upon when he had to deliver a lecture on the oneness of Allah. No wonder the Catholics during Vatican II in 1962, which it took place from 62 to 63, the Roman Catholics hardly insult Muslims because they have done a lot of research on the religion and they have got to know the truth in that religion. From 1962 to 63, the Catholics, Roman Catholics, they have a conference they call the Vatican Conference, which is held every 100 years. The first Vatican Conference was in 1862. The second one was from 1962 to 63. During that conference, the church decided to set up a committee that would investigate into Islam. The church had gotten convinced that the years before, centuries earlier, there had been some misstatements about Islam, false statements for that matter, and that the church wanted to build its relationship with Muslims based on knowledge, and therefore set up the committee to look into Islam. The committee did its work for a period of 7 years. And in 1970, it produced a 150-page document to guide the church in its dealings with Muslims and Islam. In that document, the church for the first time recognized, and I quote, that Muhammad is part of a divine scheme of salvation for mankind. And it further states that Allah, to the average Muslim, is the God of Abraham, the God of Jesus, the God of Moses, the God of Jacob, and the God of Jesus. What is the church trying to state here? The church is trying to state that the religion of Allah that goes by the name Islam truly came from the Almighty. At this point, it is important for us to move on to the second component of Islam, which is sound worship. What do we mean by sound worship? Sound worship means worshiping Allah in the manner that He has asked us to do it, not through any human ingenuity or creativity. In other words, how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want us to worship Him? I'm saying this because others have taken to music to worship Allah. Others have taken to drums to worship Allah. Others have taken to the playing of musical instruments to worship Allah. Others have taken to, dancing to worship Allah. And I always get amazed and ask a very simple question. If you walk to the palace of a king and you start to dance in front of the king, when you are supposed to present a request and make a submission, do you think the king would take such a person serious? If you jump on stage in front of the chief or the king and you start to dance, people might interpret your conduct as a sign of disrespect to the king. But some people have decided to dance and shake their bodies, and they claim they are worshiping the Almighty. Therefore, the question on what format, what form are we supposed to use to worship the Almighty is extremely important. So sound worship, what format is proposed by the Bible? What format was used by the prophets in their communication with the Almighty? Were they dancing? Were they playing music? Were they drumming? What was the format? The first step towards worship of Allah is cleanliness. One has to cleanse himself and remain pure before you stand before the Almighty. Quran chapter 5 verse 6 is very clear. That Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu idha kuntum ila salati faqsilu ujuhakum, up to the end of the text. That all you who believe, if you are about to pray, you have to perform ablution. So the book starts with the face. It means that water will have to be used to cleanse the body before one stands in front of the Almighty. This prescription by the Quran was the format that was used by the prophets before Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had directed the prophet to practice Islam, to take us back to the original religion that had been given to the prophets. So we start with the Old Testament. So one will discover at least two places in the Old Testament, in Exodus, all in Exodus, relating to Moses. Exodus chapter 30 verse 17. Moses was directed by Allah to provide a vessel, put in water, and that if they are about to enter into the house of God to pray, they should wash their hands and feet. Wash their hands and feet, symbolizing cleanliness before standing in front of the Creator. That is in Exodus chapter 30 verse 17. And then Exodus chapter 40 verses 30 to 32, also on the same subject. But this one adds that they should clean their private parts. In the New Testament, Jesus said in Matthew 5:17 that I came not to destroy the law but to fulfill it. That is Matthew 5:17. I came, Jesus speaking, I came not to destroy the law but to fulfill it. And then in Hebrew 8:28, he said that if you do not follow the path of Moses, you cannot follow my path. We will discover that he assembled all the disciples. Jesus assembled all the disciples, put water in a vessel, and started washing their feet to symbolize cleanliness before standing in front of the Creator. Then Pedro, that is Peter, said, Master, we have already taken our bath. Why are you washing our feet? Peter was bringing to the knowledge of Jesus that they had washed out and the feet had already been washed. But Jesus said, if I do not wash your feet, you are not one of my followers. So washing the feet symbolizes an act of cleanliness. Point number 2, if one cleanses himself and wants to enter into the house of God, Muslims are encouraged to remove their shoes and sandals and everything before they enter into the mosque. And that is expressed in Exodus chapter 3 verse 4 to 5 and Joshua chapter 5 verse 15. I repeat, Exodus chapter 3 verses 4 to 5 and Joshua chapter 5 verse 15. Now, how do we worship the Almighty? What format? Do we stand? Do we lie? Do we bow? What is the format prescribed by the Bible to worship the Almighty? The Quran clearly states in chapter 22 verse 77, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu rka'u wasjudu wa'budu rabbakum. That all you who believe, bow, prostrate, and worship your Lord. So bowing and prostrating have been instructed by the Quran to be used as the format for communicating with the Almighty. But unfortunately, in modern times, people have taken to music and dance, playing drums, and making unnecessary noise in society. And they do all these and rely wrongly on Psalm 150. They claim that when David defeated Goliath, he developed instruments of music and drums to praise the Almighty. The question then is, when David did that, was he condemned by Allah or Allah approved of the action? The account in the Bible indicates clearly that God Almighty condemned the act. Because in Amos chapter 5 verse 23, Amos chapter 5 verse 23, the Creator states, take away from me the noise of your songs Amos chapter 5 verse 23. Take away from me the noise of your songs. And in Amos again, chapter 6 verse 6, this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is condemning what David did. So Amos chapter 6 verse 6, Allah says, and like David, invent for themselves instruments of music. They invent for themselves, not for the Almighty, for themselves. So it means that the instruments they are using, Allah does not allow that. That is why it said, and like David, because David started it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala indirectly is saying that what David did was wrong. So he says, and like David, invent for themselves instruments of music. If songs are noise in the sight of Allah, if instruments of music are not supposed to be used as medium in reaching out to the Almighty and praying to Him and communicating with Him, what then is the format for worshiping the Almighty and praying to Him? In Matthew chapter 6 verse 9, Matthew chapter 6 verse 9, the Lord's Prayer according to Christianity goes like this: Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The point of reference here is, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So we then pose the question, what is going on up there in heaven that we also wish that it happens here? Revelation chapter 9 verse 7, chapter 7 verses 9 to 12. Revelation chapter 7 verses 9 to 12 states the following account about how the angels worship the Almighty up there. And that is what is happening in heaven. According to the account in Revelation chapter 7 verses 9 to 12, the angels, all of them, surrounded the throne of Allah. That is what is happening there. And it's constantly and consistently done. They surround the throne of Allah, praise Him, and after praising Him according to the Bible, and they fall on their faces before the throne and worship God, saying Amen. That they fall on their faces to the ground. All of them, after praising the Almighty, they will fall on their faces to the ground and say Amen. That is the format that goes on up there in establishing communion with Allah, in relating to the Almighty by the angels. And that is the wish of every Christian, that what is happening up there should happen down here. But unfortunately, that is not the case. This format of falling on their faces, which is done by the angels, was that which was done by the prophets. So we read in Genesis chapter 17 verse 3, and Abraham fell on his face and prayed. Numbers chapter 20 verse 16, the Old Testament, Moses fell on his face and prayed. Joshua chapter 5 verse 14, Joshua fell on his face and prayed. Psalm 95 verse 6, David fell on his face and prayed. And in Matthew chapter 26 verses 36 to 39, when they plotted to get rid of Jesus, he went into the garden of Gethsemane, and according to the account in Matthew, he prayed. And when he was praying, according to the account, he went a little further. Jesus went a little further, fell on his face and prayed. He moved a step further, fell on his face, and prayed with the forehead to the ground. These are individual situations. Now we should thank Allah that we are Muslims. We should thank Him for guiding us to this great religion of His. These are individuals. Abraham doing it as an individual. Moses doing it as an individual. Joshua doing it as an individual. David doing it as an individual. And Jesus also doing it as an individual. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon all of them. But what form should the prayer take when you are praying in a group? Nehemiah chapter 8 verses 2 to 4 provides the guide on this. In the Bible, Nehemiah chapter 8 verses 2 to 4, you will come across an interesting account on how an imam leads the prayer when Muslims are praying in a group. Of course, when Muslims are praying in a group, the imam leads. He reads the opening chapter and they all respond Amin, and they bow down, up, and prostrate with their faces to the ground. That is the format that the Muslims do. And that is and was the format recommended by Allah to the prophets. That is why we discover all of them falling on their faces to the ground and praying. But in this particular instance, we discover that the prophet Ezra, who was the imam at the time, assembled Zechariah, Matithia, and a host of them. They stood behind him. They filed up behind him. And he opened the book. Watch very carefully. I'm only paraphrasing. He opened the book. Praise the Almighty, according to the account. And those who were following him, all of them responded, Amen, the way the Muslims do. And I repeat the text, Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 2 to 4. The prophet Ezra opened the book, praised the Almighty, and those behind him responded, Amen. When the Muslim imam stands up to lead the prayer, he praises the Almighty in the following manner. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All praises belong to the Almighty Allah. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. The most gracious, the most merciful. Maliki Yawmiddin. King of the day of judgment. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. You alone do we worship, and from you alone we seek assistance. Ihdina surat al-mustaqim. Guide us to the right path. Surat al-ladhina an'amta alayhim. The path of those upon whom you have bestowed your blessings. غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Not the path of those who have incurred your annoyance and displeasure. When the Imam reads this chapter, the Mu'min, the Muslims who are praying behind him, all respond, Ameen. And according to the account in Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 2 to 4, when Prophet Ezra opened the book and read and praised the Almighty, they all responded, Ameen. They raised up their hands, down, bowed down, and fell on their faces to the ground. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. This has been the format of the prophets. But because of commercialization of religion, but because people are looking more for money than taking souls to the Almighty, so the bad formats, the ill formats, the ill forms continue to be used by other people. This particular format of submitting to the Almighty, bowing, prostrating with the face to the ground, is physically the highest form of human humility and submission to the Creator. The face, which is the most beautiful part of the human being, the limbs that help man to act, the knees and the feet that help man to move around, all of them representing the entire body, are dropped on the surface of the earth in total submission to the Almighty. What acts physically represents humility more than this? That is why Jesus, when he did it in Matthew chapter 26 verse 36 to 39, he said, Lord, I know you hear me and you have heard me. Yes, indeed. If the servant of Allah submits in that manner, accompanied by true faith, his prayer will be answered. No wonder the Quran in chapter 29 is very clear on the impact of this kind of submission on the servant and on society. The Quran says, Inna salata tanha anil fahsha'i wal munkar. That indeed prayer helps the poor servant of Allah to stay away from abominable acts, acts that are forbidden by the Creator. Finally, point number 3. Islam stands for sound dealings with people. Sound dealings with people. And they say the Prophet himself was said to have said, or was reported to have said, Adabani Rabbi fa ahsana ta'dibi, that my Lord has trained me and trained me well. No wonder Allah describes him in the following manner. وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلِقٍ عَظِيمٍ in Quran chapter 68, that indeed you are of an exemplary character. Consequently, the Prophet advises in the following words, many instances, that he gave advice to the servants of Allah in dealing with one another. He said, Irhamu man fil ardi yarhamukum man fis sama'. That show compassion towards those who are on earth, and the Almighty up there will also exercise compassion towards you. And he states in a very simple, clear language, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. That none of you can be a true believer unless he wishes for his brother whatever he wishes for himself. This is the third component of Islam. And in the 10 commandments, one of the key pillars of the 10 commandments is love thy neighbor as thyself. In this direction, therefore, when we pick the 3 perspectives of Islam, Islam as a sound faith, Islam as a sound worship, and Islam as sound dealings with people, we discover that the religion portrayed by the Bible itself is Islam and no other religion. If you and I are lucky to have found ourselves in the fraternity of Islam, and are Muslims for that matter, we should count ourselves lucky. Live the kind of life that will make us acceptable to the Almighty. Because with each passing day, our life on earth depreciates. If one is given even 70 years, when a day passes, depreciation has hit that lifespan. And therefore it is appropriate that we lead the kind of life that will help us attain appreciation so that when we even lose the days, we don't lose the value that we're going to enjoy in the sight of the Almighty. May the Creator be with you, sustain you, and protect you at all times. May He accept our prayers and help us worship Him in the manner that He requires us to do. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.